Welcome to session 9 of our study on Joshua and Judges. In this session, we're going to read about Gideon, who is one of the better known figures in the Old Testament. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 are a composite, a group of stories about an individual, in this case Gideon, which have been edited together. Brettler describes this as a narrative cycle, which we will see again when we talk about Samson. In this session, we'll also read about Abimelech in chapter 9 of the book of Judges. But first, a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We've called the Gideon stories a narrative cycle or a composite. This is a collection of stories about Gideon. In some of the stories, he is called Jerubbaal. We may recognize that it seems to be different versions of the same story at times in this collection. All of this because the original stories have probably different authors, but they have been edited together to create a single narrative. We will occasionally recognize where we have jumped from one to another, but in general the narrative is fairly cohesive. The story illustrates the problems that arise when people continuously look for signs and tests before they're willing to step forward in anything. We begin with chapter 6. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. The hand of Midian prevailed over Israel, and because of Midian, the Israelites provided for themselves hiding places in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. For whenever the Israelites put in seed, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the land as far as the neighborhood of Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, nor any sheep or ox or donkey. For they and their livestock would come up, and they would even bring their tents as thick as locusts. Neither they nor their camels could be counted. So they wasted the land as they came in. Thus Israel was greatly impoverished because of Midian, and the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. The Midianites were nomads, whose chief territory was east of the Jordan and generally south of Moab and Edom, east of the Gulf of Aqaba, across from the Sinai Peninsula. So let's go on to verse 7. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites, and he said to them, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not pay reverence to the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not given heed to my voice. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior. Gideon answered him, But sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our ancestors recounted to us, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has cast us off and given us into the hand of the Midian. Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you. He responded, But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord said to him, But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them. Then he said to him, If now I have found favor with you, then show me a sign that it is you who speaks with me. Do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you. And he said, I will stay until you return. Professions of inadequacy regularly occur in call narratives of the prophets. Think of Moses, for example. Gideon doesn't say no, but he asks for a sign. Gideon's family was not as poor as he suggests. We know that they had servants or slaves, so they were likely well off. We go on to verse 19. So Gideon went into his house and prepared a kid and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that it was the angel of the Lord, and Gideon said, "Help me, Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace be to you. Do not fear, you shall not die." Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. So verse 22 and 23 imply that Gideon thought he might die because he saw God's messenger face to face. God assures him that this is not the case. So he built an altar and called it Yahweh Shalom, or the Lord is Peace. It is well. Let's go on with verse 25. That night the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull, the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred pole that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here in proper order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the sacred pole that you cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the townspeople to do it by day, he did it by night. So here it says that Gideon was afraid to do it by day. Alter's translation says it was the servants who were afraid, not Gideon. But at the least he seems to go along with these fears. So we go on with verse 28. When the townspeople rose early in the morning, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the sacred pole beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. So they said to one another, "Who has done this?" After searching and inquiring, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." Then the townspeople said to Joash, "Bring out your son so that he may die, for he has pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole beside it." But Joash said to all who are arrayed against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been pulled down." Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, "Let Baal contend against him," because he pulled down his altar. The name Gideon means to hack down, so this is kind of confusing. Hack down would fit with hacking down the altar of Baal. Jerubbaal means Baal contends, or perhaps Gideon contends with Baal. Might make sense. At any rate, perhaps this is how the redactor attempts to explain the two names used in this composite. So let's go on. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet them. Then Gideon said to God, "In order to see whether you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said, I am going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung out enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not let your anger burn against me, but let me speak one more time. Let me please make trial with the fleece just once more. Let it be dry only on the fleece, and all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Gideon really wasn't comfortable until he had signs. He created one elaborate test, then reversed it a second time. The second test was miraculous. One would expect the fleece to naturally absorb moisture evaporating from the ground, but in this case the fleece was dry and the ground was damp. Apparently Gideon was convinced by this sign. We move on to chapter 7. Gideon has recruited his troops and appears ready to do battle with the Midianites. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the troops who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod, and the camp of Midian was north of them, below the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, 'My own hand has delivered me.' Now therefore proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home." Thus Gideon sifted them out. 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The troops are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them out for you there. When I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go with you. And when I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "All those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. All those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you should put to the other side." The number of those who lapped was 300, but all the rest of the troops knelt down to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 who lapped, I will deliver you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go to their homes." So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel back to their own tents, but retained the 300. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley. One suspects that behind this tale of a test that eliminates the vast majority of the fighting men, there may be a historical memory of a small group of guerrillas that defeated numerically superior Midianite forces in a surprise attack. The lapping of water like a dog perhaps is done while standing as opposed to kneeling down. The dog lapping is done by scooping up the water in one's palm, then lapping it, not putting one's face in the water as the kneelers did. We go on to verse 9. That same night the Lord said to him, "Get up, attack the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you fear to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to attack the camp." Then he went down with his servant Purah to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley as thick as locusts, and their camels were without number, countless as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, "I had a dream, and in it a cake of barley bread tumbled to the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell. It turned upside down and the tent collapsed." And his comrades answered, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has given Midian and all the army." When Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped, and he returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Get up, for the Lord has given the army of Midian into your hand." After he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars with torches inside the jars, he said to them, "Look at me and do the same when I come to the outskirts of the camp. Do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets around the camp and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" So Gideon divided his troops into 3 columns on 3 sides of the enemy camp. Let's go on to verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. So the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding in their left hand the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place all around the camp, and all the men in the camp ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zerah, and as far as the border of Abel-Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters against them, as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. They captured the 2 captains of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. As they pursued the Midianites, they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon beyond the Jordan. Oreb and Zeb mean respectively raven and wolf. The fleeing Midianite commanders were overtaken and killed east of the Jordan. Gideon himself is still west of the Jordan, but will cross over in the next episode. In chapter 8, we see a victorious Gideon, but also a vindictive one, and we also have a problem with idols. We begin chapter 8, verse 1. Then the Ephraimites said to him, "What have you done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against the Midianites?" And they upbraided him violently. So he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the captains of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" When he said this, their anger against him subsided. So what's the metaphor about the grapes here? The Ephraimites were upset about not being involved in the first wave of the battle. But Gideon points out that Ephraim was responsible for the capture and execution of the commanders Oreb and Zeb. Gideon suggests that is so much superior to Gideon's clan Abiezer that the grapes Ephraim leaves behind in harvest are better than what Abiezer actually harvests in the vineyard. So let's go on. Then Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 who were with him, exhausted but still pursuing. So he said to the people of Succoth, "Please give some loaves of bread to my followers, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have in your possession the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna, that we should give you bread to your army?" Gideon replied, "Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will trample your flesh on the thorns of the wilderness and on briars." From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them. And the people of Peniel answered him as the people of Succoth had answered. So he said to the people of Peniel, "When I come back victorious, I will break down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Kakor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men bearing arms had fallen. So Gideon went up by their caravan route east of Noabah and Jogbehah and attacked the army, for the army was off its guard. Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and threw all the army into panic. When Gideon is in pursuit of the Midian kings and asks for bread, he is rebuffed. The town elders of Succoth and Peniel really don't believe that he will capture the kings. They are more afraid of Midianite retribution. But Gideon captures them anyway, to the misfortune of those folks from Succoth and Peniel. So we go on. When Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Hares, he caught a young man, one of the people of Succoth, and questioned him, and he listed for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 people. Then he came to the people of Succoth, and he said, "Here are Zebah and Zimlah, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Do you already have in your possession the hands of Zebah and Zimlah, that we should give bread to your troops who are exhausted?' So he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he trampled the people of Succoth. He also broke down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the city." Given that he goes on to kill the elders of Peniel, we may infer that the same fatal result is achieved at Succoth by the harrying of thorns and briars, a slow and painful death. We go on to verse 18. Then he said to Zebah and Zimlah, "What about the men you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you are, so were they. Every one of them, they resembled the sons of a king." And he replied, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. The Lord lives. If you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Go kill them." But the boy did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a boy. Then Zebah and Zimlah said, "You come and kill us, for as the man is, so is his strength." So Gideon went and killed Zebah and Zimlah, and he took the crescents that were on the necks of their camels. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your sons and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hands of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Then Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Each of you give me an earring he has taken as spoil," for the enemy had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. "We will willingly give them," they answered. So they spread a garment, and each threw into it an earring he had taken as spoil. Then the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, apart from the crescents and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian and the collars that were on the necks of their camels. Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his town, in Ophrah, and in all Israel prostituted themselves to it there, and became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they lifted up their heads no more. So the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Gideon refuses to establish a dynasty. "The Lord will rule over you." They seem to be baffled by his refusal to accept a kingship. Gideon now realizes he needs to propose something to placate or reassure them. But what he proposes proves to be disastrous. He created an ephod, an idol. Let's read verse 29 to the end of the chapter. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went to live in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son. He named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash at Ophrah of the Abizrites. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites relapsed and prostituted themselves with the Baals after making Baal Bereth their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of all their enemies on every side, and they did not exhibit loyalty to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. And so we end with the same old story. After 40 years, they did not remember the Lord their God. We go down to chapter 9 and the story of Abimelech, one of the 70 sons of Gideon. We even see some more poetry in this chapter. Let's go on chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Now Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's kinfolk and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, "Say in the hearing of all the lords of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh." So his mother's kinsfolk spoke all these words on his behalf in the hearing of all the lords of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, "He is our brother." They gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the temple of Baal Bereth, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. He went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, survived, for he hid himself. Then all the lords of Shechem and all Beth Millo came together, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak at the pillar at Shechem. Abimelech is talking here about monarchy. He wants to claim the monarchy his father Gideon rejected. We also notice his financial support is coming from the temple of Baal Bereth, the local pagan temple. One should keep in mind throughout this story that the principal actors are Canaanites, not Israelites, and that Abimelech, though his father was an Israelite, shows no allegiance to the people or the God of Israel. He captures and murders his brothers one by one, probably either by stabbing or beheading. We go on. In verse 8, we have a parable. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you lords of Shechem, so that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over themselves, so they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' The olive tree answered them, 'Shall I stop producing my rich oil by which gods and mortals are honored, and go to sway over the trees?' Then the trees said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.' But the fig tree answered them, 'Shall I stop producing my sweetness and my delicious fruit, and go to sway over the trees?' Then the trees said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.' But the vine said to them, 'Shall I stop producing my wine that cheers gods and mortals, and go to sway over the trees?' So the tree said to the bramble, 'You come and reign over us.' And the bramble said to the trees, 'If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon.'" Of course, there's sarcasm in verse 15. "Come take refuge in my shade." The lowly bramble is just the thorn bush, which gives no shade. We go on with Jotham's speech. "Now therefore, if you acted in good faith and honor when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as his actions deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and rescued you from the hand of Medina. But you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his slave woman, king over the lords of Shechem, because he is your kinsman. If I say you have acted in good faith and honor with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the lords of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from the lords of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech." Then Jotham ran away and fled, going to Beer, where he remained for the fear of his brother Abimelech. With no apparent significant opposition, Abimelech begins his rule. So let's go on with verse 22. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, but God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the lords of Shechem, and the lords of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. This happened so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might be avenged, and their blood be laid on their brother Abimelech, who killed them, and on the lords of Shechem, who strengthened his hand to kill his brothers. So the lords of Shechem set ambushes against him on the mountaintops. They robbed all who passed by them along the way, and it was reported to Abimelech. So next we read about Gaal, son of Ebed, which probably means Gaal, son of a slave, or son of a slave servant of God. Verse 26. When Gaal, son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his kinfolk, the lords of Shechem put confidence in him. They went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards and trod them and celebrated. Then they went to the temple of their God, ate and drank and ridiculed Abimelech. Gaal, son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech, and who are we of Shechem that we should serve him? Did not the son of Jerubbaal and Zebul, his officer, serve the men of Hamor, father of Shechem? Why then should we serve him? If only this people were under my command, then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to him, increase your army and come out." When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. He sent messengers to Abimelech at Aramoth, saying, "Look, Gaal, son of Ebed, and his kinfolk have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore go by night, and you and the troops who are with you, and lie in wait in the fields. Then early in the morning, as soon as the sun rises, get up, rush on the city, and when he and the troops who are with him come out against you, you may deal with them as best you can." So Abimelech has been warned about this Gaal, son of Ebed, so he rounds up his troops. So Abimelech and all his troops with him go up by night and lay in wait against Shechem in 4 companies. When Gaal, son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the gate of the city, Abimelech and his troops with him rose from the ambush. And when Gaal saw them, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the mountaintops." And Zebul said to him, "The shadows of the mountains look like people to you?" Gaal spoke again and said, "Look, people are coming down from Tabor Erez, and one company is coming from the direction of Elon Minimaz." Then Zebul said to him, "Where is your boast now, you who said, 'Who is Abimelech that we should serve him?' Are not these the troops you made light of? Go out now and fight with them." So Gaal went out at the head of the lords of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him. Many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. So Abimelech resided in Aram, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his kinfolk, so that they could not live on at Shechem. On the following day, the people went out into the fields. When Abimelech was told, he took his troops and divided them into 3 companies and lay in wait in the fields. When he looked and saw the people coming out of the city, he rose against them and killed them. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the 2 companies rushed on all who were in the fields and killed them. Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He took the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. In verse 42, we read about the people who went out into the field. These people are the armed men of Shechem. Sowing a field with salt, that we see in this last verse, would make it infertile. So the likely intention is to mark this as a site, as a place of eternal desolation. We go into verse 46. When all the lords of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. Abimelech was told that all the lords of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. So Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the troops who were with him. Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brushwood and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the troops with him, "What you have seen me do quickly as I have done." So every one of the troops cut down a bundle and following Abimelech put it against the stronghold. And they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. Then Abimelech went to Thebes and encamped against Thebes and took it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and the lords of the city fled to it and shut themselves in it. And they went to the roof of the tower. And Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and came near to the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Immediately he called to the young man who carried his armor and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say about me, 'A woman killed him.'" So the young man thrust him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home. Thus God repaid Abimelech for the crime he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the wickedness of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal. Verse 53 says, "A certain woman flung down a milestone." It is noteworthy that in this book, based on a male warrior culture, first Jael and now this anonymous woman of Thebes delivered death blows to an enemy. It is such a great humiliation that Abimelech asks his armor bearer to run him through with his sword. In a more seductive feminine mode, Delilah will bring down the Israelite hero Samson in a couple sessions down the road. The story of Gideon shows how Israel, even in the very process of being delivered by the Lord Yahweh, vacillates between allegiance to him and allegiance to another god. It develops this irony that the result of the Lord's deliverance through Gideon is Israel's transition from partial to total worship of Baal Bereth after Gideon's death. The Gideon cycle also provides a somewhat negative model for the northern judges, who we contrast with southern judges. If we compare Gideon with Othniel, the Judean judge, for example, or even Ehud or Shamgar, Gideon's career begins with his inability to recognize a divine messenger. He asks for an excessive number of divine signs. He is too afraid to tear down the Baal altar by day and secretly does it by night. He is vindictive against his countrymen. His final act is setting up an ephod, an idol. But he was a judge, and Israel survived under his watch. His son Abimelech, on the other hand, is much worse, killing off his brothers. He deserves his shameful fate, being killed by a woman. In session 10, we will read chapters 10 through 14. We will hear the story of Tola and Jar and of Jephthah, and we begin the Samson cycle. I hope you can join us in our discussion on Monday evening. If you need to, send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.